Hello, my name is Anthony, and today I'm going to walk you through how to count the number of spaces in a sentence using Scratch. So I'm going to assume you guys at least know a little bit about Scratch, but if I end up going a little too fast, feel free to pause the video and take your time with the following lesson. Now, like how we begin most projects, let us navigate to the Events section and grab the block that runs the code when the flag is clicked. Then, we need some way to grab input from the user. In other words, we need to basically ask the user to type out a sentence for us. Let's once again return to the left-hand side of the screen and go to the section marked Sensing. In Sensing, there is a block in which you may ask a question to the user. This block here. You may change the question to match what we're looking for in this project. For instance, I'm going to change the question to ask, what is your sentence? Now when I run the code as is, you'll see that our cat or sprite on the right now pops up with a word bubble asking that same question. And right here, we may type out our answer or our sentence. As an example, I'll type hello world and press the enter key. It seems as if nothing happened, but in fact, the answer that we typed out is now stored in this variable here named answer. Now keep all of this in mind, but here's where things get a little tricky. So we're going to take a break from the code and talk about how our sentence or answer is actually being stored in the computer. Sentences are in fact stored as something called a string, with a string basically being a collection of characters or letters. For example, our sentence, hello world, is stored as a string. And the computer basically takes one character at a time, giving each character a number that corresponds to its position in the sentence. We will call the number associated with each character its index. So the computer reads the letter H and assigns it the index 1 because it's the first character of the sentence and the first that the computer has seen. Then the computer now looks at letter E and gives it an index of 2. The pattern continues, so the first L is given the number 3, then the second L is number 4, and finally the O has an index of 5. The computer has now reached the first space in our sentence after the O. The space is considered to be a character as well, so it is then given an index of 6. The computer continues until it reaches the final letter and gives it an index of 11, the length of our sentence. To make sure that we're all on the same page, please look at the example below and try to figure out the index for the 3 spaces in the sentence, my name is Anthony. Feel free to pause the video and come back when you have your answer. Alright, so the first space is at index 1, 2, 3. The second space is at index 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And finally, the third space is at index 9, 10, 11. Returning to the main problem that we are trying to address, how would we go about finding the number of spaces in our sentence or string? Well, we'd have to look at every single character and determine if it is a space. If it is a space, we add 1 to our total tally of the number of spaces in our sentence. Then our code will continue to check every character until there are none left. We can then notify the user of how many spaces we've counted. You may have noticed that in order for this code to come together, we're going to need 2 variables. The first variable will be the index of the character that we're currently looking at. So we start with letter H, go to letter E, and so on. Then the second variable will be the total number of spaces. Now in Scratch, you may make your variables in the section here. I'll name my first variable index, and then I'll name my second variable the total number of spaces. Now what value should our index be at the beginning of our code? At which number does our index begin, or should it begin? If you think back to our example with hello world, the index started with letter H with a value of 1. This is typical of index values, so we should repeat that pattern here by setting index equal to 1 to begin with. We should also set our variable total number of spaces equal to 0, since we have not yet found any spaces. Then, we're going to need to loop through our sentence, starting from the first character and checking every single character until we've reached the end. Knowing that we'll have to loop, we will need a repeat block. But instead of repeating our code 10 times as it is by default, we can use the length of answer. The variable answer, if you remember, corresponds to the sentence that we entered earlier, so we're looping the same number of times as the sentence's length. In our example, answer is equal to hello world, whose length is equal to 11. So in our case, this block will now repeat 11 times, once for each character in the sentence. To do so, we'll use an if block. We can then grab the current letter by asking for letter index of answer. That statement is basically equivalent to saying, please refer to the letter at the value index of the sentence that was inputted. So if index were to equal 2, then the letter would be E, since E is the second letter of our sentence. We can then check if this letter is equal to a space by grabbing this block and filling in the portion to the right by hitting the space bar. It may look like the portion to the right is unfilled, but you may highlight the space to make sure it is there. If this letter or character is in fact a space, we should then increment or increase by 1 our variable that refers to the total number of spaces. So in other words, let's change total number of spaces by 1 like so. Then there's one other major issue. I'd like you all to pause the video again to give yourself time to see if you can identify the problem yourself, as it's particularly important to identify problems in your own code. And also feel free to look at previous portions of this video if there's any confusion and you'd like to clear it up. Okay, so the primary issue is that we need to modify the value of our variable index. If we leave it as is, the index value won't change, so we'll actually constantly look at the same character. For instance, the index is set to 1, and in our example, it'll look at the letter H every single time the loop repeated. But instead, we want the index to refer to the next character in the sentence after each loop completes. We also want to make sure that we make this change outside of the if loop, since we would like the index to change regardless of whether the current letter is a space. And we should specifically modify index by adding 1 as we seek to continue referring to each character in the sentence. Now the code is basically complete. Let's go line by line to make sure every piece of the code is understood. We begin by asking the user, "What is your sentence?" and waiting for their response. Once the response is submitted, we set our variable index equal to 1, which will have it begin with the first letter of our sentence. We also set the total number of spaces equal to 0. Then we loop for whatever the number of characters there are in the user inputted sentence. So once again, in our example, there are 11 characters in the phrase hello world, so we loop 11 times. With each loop, we look at the latest character in the sentence, checking to see if it is a space. So for instance, we start with the letter H. It is not a space, so we do not increase the total number of spaces by 1, but we still do increment index by 1 before the loop completes. Then, once it gets to index 6, we do increase the total number of spaces by 1. We continue to do so until we reach the end of the sentence and have looked through every single character. The last piece of code we may add is returning our solution to the screen by having the cat either say or think the solution out loud. I'll use the think block, and we'll have to say two different things, so we should use a join statement. The first portion of the phrase can be something you choose. I'll have the cat think the following sentence. The number of spaces is blank, and I'll join that phrase with the variable total number of spaces. Now when we run our code, after inputting our sentence, hello world, the cat will have a thought bubble that will describe how many spaces there are in the sentence, which is equal to 1 in this case. Go ahead and try a few different phrases to make sure everything is working properly. That concludes our project, and I encourage you all to try completing the project on your own in a few days or weeks, and feel free to leave any questions in the comments. Thank you.